Coming up, Tony Banks from Genesis.
Hey, babe, your supper's waiting for you. Hey, my baby, don't you know our love is true? I've been so far from here, far from your warm arms. It's good to feel you again. It's been a long, long time, hasn't it?
Tony, what were the classical influences on Genesis when you were starting out?
Well, I suppose the classical thing was one influence, really. It hadn't really been done that much in pop music at the time. There had been things like Days of Future Past, the Moody Blues, which used an orchestra, but they were kind of separate, I suppose. And the ideas of sort of mellotrons and stuff, where you have the string sounds, was an aspect to it. I think we were as much influenced by just straight ahead pop, really. We were all big pop fans, particularly sort of Beatles, Kinks, Zombies, Animals, and then Beach Boys, and in America, all these sort of soul groups, particularly Town and Motown and Otis Redding and Wilson Pickett, all that. That's kind of what shaped me anyhow. Me and Peter, I think particularly, we were quite influenced by the American soul stuff. And so it was a sort of combination of things, really, and just trying to do, I think, things that hadn't been done before was what we were looking for. I mean, the fun was that people, most pop music in those days was built up around, a few chords here and there. It was getting more adventurous by the end of the 60s, but, so the idea that everything was open for you, all these chord changes that had never been used, was see if they could work. Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't.
A lot of the music you mentioned came originally from the blues, I think it's fair to say. Did you listen to blues?
Listen a bit to blues. I quite like the basic blues. I love the vocal, actually. I always love the vocal, but I would say I needed just that little bit more kind of harmonic interest, which I suppose came from people like Otis Redding mentioned. Obviously, the Town and Motown people, particularly the songs written by Holland Dozier Holland, things like Reach Out, I'll Be There and stuff. So those were sort of very strong influence. But I mean, the Beatles were sort of were it for me, I suppose, my main thing. But all the other groups I mentioned were very important too.
But it's quite a leap from the Beatles or the Beach Boys to say Supper's Ready, isn't it?
Obviously Supper's Ready is a long piece, but I think, the Beach Boys, particularly obviously with Pet Sounds, I suppose, was a real quantum leap in pop music, I think, in terms of the chords used, and the whole approach, I think, was just so completely different in terms of sound. And I think that really sort of kick-started the whole change, which came with groups that came after that, which we were quite influenced by, people like Procol Harum and Family, even Fairport Convention, was a folky group, but it's just trying to sort of expand it a bit further, with a bit of length. I remember The Who with A Quick One While He's Away was sort of an extended piece, quite simple pieces, but made something more of all the pieces because they were joined together, I think, and we rather liked that. And the idea of going on and on and on, and we had pieces longer than Supper's Ready before Supper's Ready, a 30-minute piece unpretentiously called The Movement, which we pillaged later on for lots of other bits. But there was an opening at that stage in the late sort of 60s, early 70s for clubs that would play where you could do uncommercial music and you would pick up an audience. I think what we were all trying to do in very different ways, I think, having to say, a lot of the groups, was just trying to sort of see what else could be done. And, we had two ways of doing it, really. One was to sort of consciously go this way and that. And I loved weird chords, so that was always going to be something I did. The other was, which I think was slightly more interesting in many ways, was what I mentioned with The Who, with A Quick One, that of just putting simpler bits, but putting them together in a way that enhances each one, so that you have quite a sort of soft bit followed by a loud bit followed by a slow bit followed by a fast bit, and see what happens. And that was, I think, was the secret of Supper's Ready, really, which is it's the contrast between the bits that really works. I suppose I was sort of chief link man, really, so that if the two things were in a kind of absurd keys in relation to each other, I had to find a way of getting between the two. The old diminished chord was always quite helpful in that instance. But you did it in such a way, and you could sort of try and make the links. Recorded the thing in sort of two sections. In fact, we didn't put it together until just before the album was finished. So we never actually heard it as one piece. We played it, obviously, but never heard it as one piece. And that was really quite exciting, actually. And I remember thinking, this is really exciting, because it was totally unlike anything else, I think, that had ever been done. And it sort of worked, in a way. Even was trying just something new and something quite exciting, and perhaps it was a bit of a quite revolutionary in its own way.
You're listening to Prog Rock with Charles Hazlewood here on BBC Radio 2. Firth of Fifth from Selling England by the Pound was very much your piece.
Well, it ended up being a kind of like ghetto for Tony Banks' music on that album, I think. I think the others sort of felt we put it all in one song, that gets it out of the way. I had these three bits, really. One which was a piano introduction, another which was a flute and piano melody, and another bit which was the main song, the vocal part of it. And I had a sort of idea of fitting them all together, but, it wasn't necessarily what I was going to do. I think it really took off when the idea of going electric big with the flute and piano solo, which I'd seen as very small, and it was Steve Hackett's idea really to let's just try it big. You've got the mellotron, go for it, and we did, and Phil played sort of a slow drum, and it suddenly became a sort of real piece and became one of the sort of climaxes of the show in those days, I think. In terms of what I was thinking about, I don't know really. I was always trying to just play with the chords a little bit. There was, I suppose, to some extent, that solo part was slightly influenced by It's a Man's World by James Brown, where I just love the way that it was sort of minor chords, and then when the sort of major chord comes in, it kind of gives you such a big boost. And that was what I was thinking of, which I'm sure you really want to talk about chord sequences. But in terms of the other part, what became the opening, which has become a little bit of a party piece for a number of people. If you go to YouTube, you'll find a lot of versions of it, all playing it much better than me, I have to say. I don't know, I had this sort of the arpeggio idea I'd kind of developed right from the early days of playing arpeggios behind vocals and stuff, and this particular one, and just sort of happened, I got that opening part, and then once I got this idea of forgetting about time signatures and just sort of going, doing what felt right to me, because, I'm quite happy to do that, the idea of all the other bits sort of came with it, really, and it became a, I was very excited about it, really, and it works well when the whole group plays it as well later on, it becomes very prog rock in a sense, but it still works.
Do you think that as over time Genesis music became less complex, that you put your classical ideas into your solo LPs?
To some extent, but I think I got, simplicity is also a slight sign of confidence, I think. It's sort of much easier to write a 26-minute song that goes through lots of changes than it is to write a 3.5-minute pop song, actually. Funnily enough, I think. Certainly a successful one. My first solo album, A Curious Feeling, was very definitely a prog rock album, if you like. There was a concept album for a start. It was quite expansive in terms of the harmony and everything used on it, and for me, it was still one of my favourite things I ever did. But, and then later on after that, you keep on bashing away. It wasn't necessarily more complex. There was room for the more complex stuff, I suppose. I didn't get anyone saying to me, use another diminished chord. I'm not allowed to do that. Well, that's a chord too far, Tony, I could always go a chord too far on my solo albums, which was probably my undoing, I think. But, it gave you the outlet for doing stuff on your own, to be able to craft everything in the way you wanted it. And, I loved making the records. Putting them out wasn't quite so much fun, but the making of them was great fun, and I'm still, still there's a lot of good stuff there.
There's complexity, lots of different chords in your orchestral albums. In Blade from 6 Pieces, for instance, I can hear Vaughan Williams, British composers. What were you listening to?
Well, I've always listened to a lot of classical music over the years, I suppose, and I've always liked it very much. The thing about Blade in particular was I really wrote it originally just with a piano and synthesizer. So piano was playing very fast all the way through, and the synthesizer was playing the line you hear with the string which the violinist plays. And I just wanted to try and get it away from being that. So when we were working on the arrangement, I said, we're going to get away from the piano, we won't use the piano at all. We try and create the speed with everything else. And that's what we did, I suppose, really. The original one with piano is quite good, but it sounds like a Genesis piece. Take away the piano and it sounds more, it had more scope as to what you could do with it. And it ends up being very exciting, I think, you know. Yes, I was very influenced, to come back to your original question, which I totally ignored. I'm also influenced by the English composers. I think Vaughan Williams a lot. I love some of what Vaughan Williams does. I think he does some fantastic stuff and some less fantastic stuff. But also, you know, all the people I've always loved, like Rachmaninoff and Ravel and all the rest of it, they're all a bit in there, I suppose, but hopefully there's something new as well. My most favourite kind of music, I suppose, is music that is conventional to some extent, but is more imaginative harmonically. That's why I love music from sort of like the mid-19th century onwards more, I suppose, than the stuff that came before in many ways. And then it gets a bit too weird for me after a bit, you know. But while it was still sort of like imaginative and interesting harmonically, Shostakovich, I suppose, was the last practitioner of sort of that, really, and I loved his music. So those are all influences.
You chose Tonight, Tonight, Tonight as a favourite Genesis song.
I wanted just a song, really, which I don't have a solo keyboard kind of thing, you know. Phil set up what I thought was a really atmospheric drum box rhythm on that. And I started playing these things on top of it, just using a marimba sample, you know, with chords kind of hidden in there. And really just two chords, really. And it had such a strong atmosphere. It was a complete atmosphere build. You start off with this thing, drum box sets it up, then you bring in these chords, and immediately you're somewhere slightly mysterious, and you're not quite sure where it's going. It's sort of impending. And the two chords sort of, they slowly unfold until they come to the big chorus chords, of which become much more happy and kind of, you know, the nostalgia again creeps in. The chord sequence kind of something that I think just really, really works well. It was something that kind of came up in the rehearsal room, you know, I was improvising, if you like. We just improvised and recorded the improvisation. You know, Phil starts sort of singing on top of it. And I think particularly because he uses the note he uses in that very first line, that again enhances that sort of slightly difficult quality about it, you know. So I love the way that does that. Of course, the middle instrumental is a sort of little, I don't know what you would call it really, it's almost classical. It's strings and oboes and everything, but done over this very definitely rock rhythm, which I think again is something that works quite well. And I think the combination of rock and with a slight classical edge, which we've done obviously many times over the years, but I think can be very effective, and that was one of them.
The word improvisation has come up quite a lot in this conversation. Not a word one associates with Genesis, who are criticised occasionally for reproducing their studio albums almost robotically on stage. Forgive me for saying that. So you obviously do use improvisation.
Well, we don't improvise on stage. The improvisation happens during the writing period, and particularly during the later periods of Genesis, really from sort of Abacab onwards, or particularly with Genesis and Invisible Touch and We Can't Dance. They were absolutely constructed out of improvisations. That's all we did. We just went in the studio with nothing written at all and just started playing. Often a drum machine would start it, sometimes it'd be a guitar riff, sometimes it'd be a chord sequence, and then you'd kind of develop it like that. So obviously while you were writing these things, there's some pretty nasty noises going on, you know, because Mike can get a bit stuck in a riff. I mean, he plays great riffs, but he plays a riff a lot. And if I don't want to stay in the same key all the time, I've got to kind of do something. So you play something ugly and hope he'll change with you, you know, and that sort of would produce ideas. And because of the drum machine, Phil was very often able to improvise vocals along at the same time. So sometimes what was apparently a fairly ordinary chord sequence, but because of something he sang on top of it, gave a great result. And something like No Son of Mine, for example, is a very straight chord sequence, but something about just the notes he sang on top of it just made it sound special, you know. So we kept, you know, once we got the idea, we kept it in the back of our minds. We'd tape everything we did. And sometimes you go back to a tape and you'd find something you hadn't even remembered you'd played and it would sound good. So, you know, we use any technique we like, really, but the improvisation was very important in those days. In the earlier days, a lot of the stuff really came from individuals and was joined together. And then we would kind of do improvisations to make them expand, if you like. You know, I mean, you know, you come in with something fairly basic. Sometimes they come with a complete piece, like One for the Vine or something. Other times they come in with something with just a riff and a chord sequence, which was like, say, In the Cage. But a lot of the stuff was built out of pieces that were written individually. Supper's Ready, for example. I mean, you know, like the opening section was something I wrote on guitar, actually. And I didn't often write on guitar, but I quite like guitars because I didn't quite know what I was doing most of the time, so I could just sort of play it and see what happened. And a couple of the other pieces in that, in fact, the bit that came the end section, the Sure as Eggs is Eggs, was nothing like what I originally wrote, but it is the same chord sequence and melody line to some extent. So, you know, that was that. And then you had some of the Apocalypse, which was built out of an improvisation, which Mike and I did, really. He had this idea of playing bass pedals and guitar, but he was playing kind of a lot of notes. And I said, look, if you just playing an E, so I said, if you just play F sharp and B, I can play pretty much any chord on top of that. So he worked out a riff that just used those 3 notes. And then I could do anything. I could be major, minor, happy, sad, dramatic, I tried to sort of keep back so that the big 666 section was the big C chords came in. I wanted to hold that right back until that moment, because I knew that would be really dramatic, having had all this other stuff beforehand. And I originally saw it as instrumental, I have to say. And then when Peter came along and he had these vocals for it, I was initially very pissed off. Thought he's singing on my bit, But then, of course, it sounded fantastic. I mean, 666, that bit is probably one of the strongest bits in the whole of the early Genesis canon, if not the whole period. It was fun, to do that, to try and see how long you could play on one riff, in a way, but make it sound interesting. I mean, I know some people say it's an interminable keyboard solo with a good vocal bit at the end, but hopefully you're trying to build up the sort of play with the emotions before you get to that bit, and then when you finally do get to it, it's such a sort of strong moment.
Supper's Ready, a kind of evergreen track from Genesis, and my great thanks to Tony Banks. Next week, I'll be talking to John Wetton, bass guitarist with Prog supergroups UK, Asia, and King Crimson. But now, from me, Charles Hazlewood, good night.